was a quiet evening, just a few days before Christmas. I was alone in my flat, enjoying my first evening of Christmas leave with my dog Max, who was curled up at the foot of my couch. The weather was really nasty outside, and the flat that I was in at the time was a corner unit, so whenever the wind blew particularly hard, it created this cartoonish howling sound, which, if you were nice and warm inside, was actually quite comforting. Etienne! It was about 6 o'clock, and I was on my couch, under a pile of blankets, sipping a cup of coffee, when I heard a knock at my door. It wasn't a loud knock, but it was sudden enough to startle me. It wasn't often that anyone knocked on my door, because we had an intercom system for the building. If someone was knocking, it was most probably one of my neighbors. I didn't hesitate to get up and walk down the corridor towards the front door. But out of curiosity, I had looked through the peepholes so I could see who it was. And there was a man, dressed as Father Christmas, with a clipboard in one hand and one of those plastic charity collection cups in the other. You know, the kind with just a little slot in the top to put money in. He was wearing the whole Santa Claus getup, hat and fake silvery beard included, so I couldn't see exactly who was underneath it. But the clipboard and collection cup had me assuming that it was one of my neighbors collecting for charity. I cracked the door open just a sliver, keeping the chain lock in place, and then said, "And?" The assumption that he was about to explain what charity he was collecting for, etc. But after taking an instant's-looking step towards the door and raising the collection cup, the man lunged at the door and pressed his weight against it in an attempt to force it open. His eyes were the only part of him that I could really see, but the way they changed in that moment was absolutely terrifying. They were so wide, and his face turned so red. But as he pushed, the door chain caught with a loud metal snap. It was holding, but just barely, and I remember how panic rose up in me as he continued to push. The door rattled on its hinges as the man shoved even harder, growling sometimes under his breath as he forced his hand through the gap, his fingers clawing at the chain. Everything happened in a blur. I tried to push the door shut, but he was too strong, and when the chain suddenly snapped, the door flew open and he was inside. As he came towards me, the smell of alcohol hit me like a wave. I screamed, backing away as fast as I could, but the apartment was small. There was nowhere to run. My back hit the wall and he was on me, his breath hot and rancid as his hands grabbed my arms, and he used his weight to pin me in place. Then I heard the low, guttural growl cutting through the chaos like some blade. And in the corner of my vision, I saw Max leap up off the couch, his hackles raised and teeth bared. And I'd never seen him like that before. He'd always been such a sweet, gentle dog with people and other animals, but that night, he was transformed into a furious, snarling beast. Max launched himself at the man and bit the arm that he was using to hold me. "Let me," the man screamed, and then loosened his grip as he tried to shake Max off. I remember seeing skin and blood under his torn red suit as Max held on, growling loudly the whole time. The man stumbled back, hammering his other fist against the top of Max's head, but he was relentless. He bit and clawed, his sheer determination driving the man further away from me, giving me time to scramble to my feet. My legs trembled so badly that I could barely stand, but adrenaline pushed me to grab the first thing I could reach, which happened to be a very heavy wooden Buddha statue from the shelf. I hurled it at the man, point blank too, and it hit him so hard in the face that it split his forehead open. He shouted something terrible, staggering backwards while bringing up a hand to his face. Max let go of his arm, but then chased him all the way down the corridor, snapping at his legs as he staggered back towards the open doorway, with blood streaming down his face and onto that fake silvery white beard. He stumbled out of my flat, but Max stopped at the threshold to bark ferociously at him as the man disappeared down the stairs. No one came out of their flats to help me. Most had gone home to see family elsewhere, I think, and anyone in those flats either didn't hear the commotion or just pretended not to. For a moment, after I pulled Max in and closed the door, there was silence, except for Max's ragged breathing. I managed to walk back into my living room, and then I sat down on the couch again, trembling in a state of disbelief. It all happened so suddenly, and it had ended just as quickly. I think that it must have been no more than 2 minutes from the knock on my door to me sitting back down on my couch again. It was all surreal. Max trotted over to me, his tail wagging slightly as he looked up at me with this sort of "I did a good job" look. And I wrapped my arms around him, burying my face in his fur, and I started to cry. Eventually, I managed to pull myself together enough to call the police. They arrived quickly, and I explained everything, and they examined the scene before taking a few photos of the broken door chain. They were both very nice, and as one of the officers knelt down to pet Max, he said, "This one's a little hero, isn't he?" And I couldn't have agreed more. If it hadn't been for him, I don't know what would have happened. And thinking about it makes my stomach churn. The man in the Santa suit was caught not far away, still bleeding from the bites my dog had given him. The police later told me that he had a criminal record, a very long one, which honestly didn't surprise me. But what did surprise me was how brazen he'd been about it, how he'd just knocked on someone's door almost at random. But it wasn't at random, not according to the police. It couldn't have been. And what they told me would come to haunt me for a very long, long time. And that night in bed, as I laid there with Max curled up beside me, I couldn't sleep. The apartment felt too quiet, too dark, and every little noise made my heart race. But whenever the fear threatened to overwhelm me, I reached out and rested my hand on Max's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. No. He was my protector, my best friend, and I never felt so fortunate to have him in my life. Christmas came and went, but the break-in had a way of overshadowing things. I asked my mom not to tell anyone about it over Christmas dinner because it was a chance for me to try and forget about it, even if it was just for an afternoon. And she gave me the words, "Try and forget about it," even if it was just for an afternoon. But even then, it was still there in the background. I felt a lot less safe back in my flat, and any safety that I felt before felt like a silly little illusion. But I also felt a deep sense of gratitude. I was okay. Max had saved me, and that was all that mattered. From that day onward, I never took his loyalty for granted. I gave him extra treats, took him on extra long walks, and gave him all the love I could possibly give. He had been there for me when I needed him most, and I would spend the rest of my life repaying that debt. It was the day before Christmas, and the store was chaotic with last-minute shoppers. Parents rushed through the aisles, pushing carts piled high with wrapping paper, decorations, and toys, and the shelves were almost bare, with only a few items left that looked like decent gifts. And people seemed frantic, grabbing whatever they could find. I was in the toy section, trying to find something for my niece, and it was very slim pickings. Then I noticed a toy on the shelf that seemed to be the hot item. It was brightly colored and packaged to grab attention, and there was only a couple left, and I saw two parents reach for the same one at the exact same time. One was a man, and the other was a woman. And they both grabbed it and wouldn't let go. They started arguing right away. Their voices were sharp and loud, cutting through the noise of the store. Other shoppers began to notice and stopped to watch. None invaded their sleep. End of How Ghost Things Get Squirrely. Neither of them would back down. The man pulled on the toy, but the woman held on tightly, and they were glaring at each other. And their faces were just red with frustration, and it was clear that neither was going to give up. The tension grew as they continued to fight over this toy. The man shoved the woman, and she stumbled but didn't seem to fall, and she came right back at him, reaching for the toy again, and that's when it escalated. The man leaned in and bit her arm. Hard. She screamed, and I saw blood starting to rush down her arm from where his teeth had broken the skin. Olaf murmured. People nearby gasped and backed away. Some tried to step in, but the man was still holding on to the toy, his grip seemingly unrelenting, and the woman clutched her arm, wincing in pain. But she didn't let go of the toy either. Store employees came running, and somewhere in the background, I could hear the faint sound of sirens getting closer. And eventually, the man dropped the toy onto the floor. And he looked around, and his chest was just heaving as he tried to catch his breath. And then he turned and started walking away, like nothing had happened at all. The woman was still holding her arm, and she bent down and picked up the toy. And she seemed to clung to it like it was the most important thing in the world. The police arrived shortly after, and the man was taken away. The woman was given first aid for the bite, and she looked shaken and pale, but refused to let go of that toy. The crowd that gathered slowly dispersed, and the store fell quiet again. People whispered as they walked away, avoiding that section of the store. And I left the store without buying anything. My hands were empty, but my mind was full of many questions. How could something like that, like a toy, lead to such violence? And as I walked to my car, I kept thinking about the child who would receive that toy. Would they ever even really know what their mom went through to get it? I hoped they wouldn't, but they couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that the whole scene had left behind. Christmas Eve was cold. I was walking through the streets, carrying a bag of gifts, and the sidewalks were busy, and there were lights and decorations everywhere. I saw a man sitting on the curb near an empty lot, and his coat was very old and torn. He had a long beard and wore a beanie, and I thought he was homeless and needed help. I felt bad for him. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a $20 bill. I walked over and held it out to him, and he looked at me, but his eyes didn't seem thankful. He didn't look happy at all. He just sort of stared. I thought he was surprised, so I leaned down and put the money in his hand, and as soon as I did, he stood up very quickly. It was bigger than I expected, and he moved fast. I stepped back, but he grabbed my coat and pushed me down. My back hit the ground, and I couldn't get up. And he started hitting me. If only you deleted that voice, slow milk. His fist came down hard, and I tried to cover my face, but it didn't help. My head was spinning, and everything hurt. And I could hear people walking by, but no one stopped. I couldn't call for help. I couldn't. I tried to call for help. I sat up. After a while he stopped, and he stood over me, breathing heavily, and he bent down, picked up the $20, and put it in his pocket, and then he walked away. I just laid there, too hurt to move, and when I finally sat up, my coat was torn and my face was bleeding. My bag of gifts was on the ground, so I picked it up, and the lot where the man had been sitting was empty now, and I didn't know where he went. I just walked home slowly, and every step hurt. The streets didn't look as cheerful anymore, and the lights and decorations didn't seem bright. I just wanted to get inside and forget what happened. When I got home, I sat by my window and looked outside, and there was snow falling. My body hurt, but I felt a lot worse on the inside. I kept thinking about the man and the look on his face. Every time I see him, I feel a little jolted, and there's the name he gave his mouth. He didn't just seem angry. It was something else, something I didn't understand. The next morning was Christmas, and I opened the gifts that I had bought for myself, but it didn't make me happy. All I could think about was that guy, and I wondered why he got so angry and why he attacked me, and I just couldn't figure it out. I spent the rest of the day feeling uneasy, and I kept looking out the window, but there was nothing there. And still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, and I didn't know if I would ever feel normal again. It was a Monday, exactly 1 week before Christmas, when I arrived home from work to find a package on my family's front porch. I was in my final year of high school, and I'd landed myself a holiday job so I could buy gifts. But since I was on the early shift and finished around 2 or 2:30, I used to get home way earlier than my mom and dad when it was still light outside. It was addressed to my dad, around the size of a shoebox, and had "Handle with care" written on the plain brown wrapping paper. It didn't look like a Christmas gift, but since it was that time of the year, I figured that's what it was. I carefully picked it up and immediately noticed that it felt much heavier than it looked. I remember thinking, okay, whatever's inside must have been expensive, because the weight of it, coupled with the "Handle with care" thing, that made me think that it was some dishware, maybe even a car stereo, the kind of thing that he was into. Carefully, I set it down on the kitchen table, trying to figure out who it might be from. My dad didn't have many friends, and he spent most of his time at work, so I figured it was either from a client or someone from his small circle of friends. I didn't put too much thought into it, though, because all would be revealed come Christmas when he opened it. At least, that's what I thought. Mom came home a few hours later, then Dad was the last to get home at around 6 that evening. We showed him the package the second that he'd stepped in the kitchen. Then, after making coffee and asking us about our days, Dad took the package up to his office. Mom told him that he should wait till Christmas before opening it, but Dad was right when he said nothing on the package marked it out as a gift, and the wrapping paper was plain, and there wasn't any sort of "Merry Christmas" written on the tag. The only distinctive marking it had was my dad's name, so he figured it was something to do with work and wouldn't be particularly exciting. The last thing my mom said to him was something like, "Well, if it's edible, at least share some with us." And he said he would, and then he walked out of the kitchen. Seconds after my dad carried the package up to his office, I finished my coffee, put the cup in the sink, and then walked into the family room and flopped down on the couch in front of the TV. I was flicking through the channels when I called out to my mom, asking what time dinner was going to be ready. There was no real reply, so I turned back to Leotonov. I didn't get to finish that sentence, though. I was midway through when we both heard this very tremendous bang coming from upstairs, and we met each other in the hallway. Mom and myself, I mean. And then ran upstairs to see what the hell made that noise. Mom made it to the door of my dad's office first, and when she opened it, I didn't see what was inside. I just sort of smelled this burning of chemicals before Mom started to scream. And what happened next was kind of a blur. I remember looking into the office and seeing my father, but then immediately slamming the door closed again because he wasn't him anymore. It was a complete mess in there. Pieces of him were everywhere, and I knew he was dead. There was no bringing him back, and there was so much blood and bits of body everywhere that my gut reaction was to just not want to see him. My priority was Mom, and it kind of amazes me how I figured all that out in a fraction of a second, totally wordlessly. She saw what she saw and screamed, like you might expect any regular person to do when they see their life partner blown apart in front of them. But with me, it was like a shutdown. Emotionally, I mean. So, I could deal with the fact that my mom was having a complete nervous breakdown right before my eyes. And after that nervous breakdown, right before my eyes, given what she'd seen, what we'd just seen, there was no telling what she was going to do. The only thing I could get her to focus on was calling 911. So that's what we did. But then she told the 911 operator what had happened, and then that sent her into a spiral again. She wailed and cried and passed the phone over to me, and I had to leave the room just to be able to focus on what was coming out of my mouth. It was terrible. Without a doubt, the single worst thing I've ever experienced. And I know for a fact that I'll never get over it. And that's what you see when you do that. But that's not because it was so sudden or violent. It's because even all these years later, we have no idea who sent that package or why. The only clue I got is how people at his job acted in the time after his funeral. Dad worked for some import or export company that operated out of Los Angeles and San Diego. He made them a lot of money, and he was paid handsomely for his services. The company was amazing in the initial aftermath of his death, and they paid all of his funeral costs, made sure the life insurance and pension money came through, and even offered to pay for me and my mom to head off on a vacation to Hawaii for about a month, though we didn't accept that offer. And when it came time for me to try and find out what Dad actually did for them, as in what his job was, they completely shut down and started stonewalling us. They basically said that they were more than happy to assist with any further financial costs in relation to Dad's murder. But when it came time to finding out so much as a scrap of information about how he actually made the member money, that was against company policy. They promised that they'd work hand in hand with the cops should they reach out to talk to them. But then, according to those very same cops, the company only did the bare minimum that they were legally required to do, and then their lips were sealed. As one cop put it, they went out of their way to ensure that we only had a vague job title and description in the form of product acquisition, and very little else. We didn't know what his day-to-day looked like. We didn't know the names of the people he worked with. And when it came to the possibility of Dad making any enemies through his job, his bosses and co-workers were less than helpful. It made no sense to us at the time. How could they be so helpful and not get in trouble with the law for, I don't know, obstruction of justice or something like that? Well, they had lawyers, a lot of them. who helped them stay well within the legal guidelines, while at the same time keeping us and the cops almost completely in the dark. We had no idea who had sent that bomb, no idea why they'd wanted to kill my father, and no idea how the hell they'd managed to make the whole thing completely untraceable. The only thing the cops could think of was that whoever built that bomb and delivered it to our house had been hired as a professional to do a job. In other words, my dad was killed by a corporate hitman. They never found the guy that did it, and we never found if anyone paid to have him killed, and if so, who. The pain has gotten easier over the years, and Mom definitely still struggles with it from time to time, but in terms of being able to function as a family, things have gotten a lot better. Sure, the only thing I've struggled with is the resentment that I feel towards the people he worked with, the people who abandoned us when we needed them most, and the people, I'm pretty sure, have intimate knowledge of the circumstances in which my dad was murdered. I've had 2 different therapists tell me that if I let it, my resentment will be the thing that destroys me. But I disagree. I think the only people who will really suffer if I let that happen are the people who know what happened to my dad. Ireland is my home, and I love it here, but there's no denying it's a very strange place with a very violent past. We love a good ghost story here, and I think half the pubs and churches and County Offaly are supposed to be haunted. But I've got a little theory regarding our affinity with the macabre. You see, when your lush green emerald isle is thus, because it's been watered with the blood of countless conflicts, a daft old story about some wailing apparition is considered entertainment. The story I've got for you today isn't one of ghouls, ghosts, or goblins. It's something that actually took place in a little village named Kilmoola. In Old Gaelic, Kilmoola means the forested hill, which isn't a very creative name for a place that sits on a hill with a load of trees on it, but it was there for hundreds upon hundreds of years before a slow, steady decline saw it abandoned and derelict. Being right on the border between Great Britain and Free Ireland, the area around Kilmoola became a hotspot for cross-border arms smuggling from the 60s onwards. At any one time, the place was either crawling with police, British Army, or the IRA, which was naturally a lot of bother for the folks living there." End quote. And so by the early 90s, the place was a ghost town. I know all that because my granddad grew up in Kilmoola, and I thought that he'd be sad to see his childhood home a crumbling ruin that doesn't even appear on maps after about 2010. But he once told me that Kilmoola becoming a derelict was the best thing to ever happen to it. He said it was a terrible place where terrible things happened, and he was glad his family moved away when they did. I was in my late 20s when he told me that, and it stunned the rest of my family as much as it did me. We'd always assumed that he'd had quite a happy childhood, but it turned out our granddad had never really talked about growing up in Kilmoola. Deft, I hear, he said there was a very beautiful park come at Dill. He'd mentioned old school friends here and there. He'd often spoken of his family too, but he'd stayed relatively quiet about his place of birth. So much so that when he did finally tell us about it, we could barely believe our ears. His old lady was basically her daughter. He always knew she was just missing her spoon. According to Granddad, Kilmoola was, for want of a better word, cursed. He was deadly serious when he said it was a place where terrible things happened, and nearly one Christmas evening, once we'd all settled after dinner, he told us a story that I'll never forget. According to Granddad, Kilmoola had been the site of many a massacre, even before 3/4 of the village was slaughtered by Cromwell's army back in the 17th century. But it was the events following Kilmula's reconstruction that gave the village its reputation. There were all kinds of strange deaths and disappearances. People went mad or developed strange illnesses. But without a shadow of a doubt, the worst thing that happened during Grandpa's childhood happened during Joseph Flaherty's Christmas shindig. The Flaherty family owned a small farm on the opposite side of the River Blackwater, and on it they had a farmhouse, a few fields, and a whiskey distillery. They weren't exactly a wealthy family by any stretch of the imagination, but they had a few friends and employees, and they'd like to throw a little shindig every Christmas to say thank you for everyone's love and hard work. As you can imagine, the presence of a distillery on the land made the Flaherty shindigs very popular affairs, and none were so popular as their Christmas get-together. Year after year, they threw the best party in the whole of County Monaghan, until one year in the early 30s, when the Flaherty family threw their final shindig. As November rolled over into December and festive feeling began to spread among the townsfolk, people began to look forward to the annual Christmas shindig. But then one night, someone pinned a note to the Flaherty's door, and roughly speaking, this is what it said: "Your irreverence for the holy season has gone on long enough. Proceed, and there will be consequences." The note was evidently referring to the Christmas shindig, which, given the abundance of whiskey on the premises, were always rowdy affairs, where music was played long into the night. But the note wasn't signed, and nor did they specify what those consequences might be. Furious inquiries were made, with the family patriarch Joseph demanding to know who'd pinned the note to their door. He asked almost everybody in Kilmola face to face, demanding each of them to swear they knew nothing of the note or its author. Most people were horrified and told Joseph that not only had it not been them that left the note, but he'd be the first person they told if they found out. Convinced it was merely a lone killjoy hoping to ruin his fun, old Joe Flaherty went ahead with planning his shindig. In fact, one might say in typical Irish fashion, he redoubled his efforts. As a show of defiance, he organized for a full band to travel down from Monaghan town, promised a festive feast that outdid anything that had come before, and, according to Grandad, was even rumored to have purchased a few bottles of the finest champagne from a purveyor in Dublin. As the weeks went by and the date of the shindig approached, Grandad remembered people getting more and more excited with each passing day. People had to work very hard back then to maintain what little they had. So the idea of being able to let their hair down and dance away their worries was obviously of massive appeal. And it appealed to a hell of a lot of people, too. Usually the Flaherty family extended invitations to friends, families, and employees, but that year, they told their employees to bring their friends, and their friends' friends, and just about anyone who'd fancy a good, old-fashioned piss-up. And then before long, half of County Monaghan was expecting the night of their lives in the old Flaherty house. But not Grandad. He said the Flaherty's Christmas shindigs were no place for a child, and with all that drink and all those unmarried young people, it was safe to say that some very ungodly things occurred at those shindigs. But that's exactly why my granddad's older brother, so my great-uncle, was so excited to attend. He'd had his eye on a girl from the next town over, Molly or Holly or whatever, and having heard that she was planning on attending, he was dead set on going himself to try and court her. But as it turns out, going to that shindig was the biggest mistake he ever made. And so on the night of the party, all the attendees had off in their finest clothes and dancing shoes, all intending on having the night of their lives. Some weren't expected home until the wee small hours of the morning, and others not until the following day. Though at first, their unexpected absences were met with nothing but assumptions of a grand old hootenanny. County Monaghan's wives and mothers weren't best pleased. That much is true, and Granddad remembers his mum getting in a right old nark that my brother failed to come home. But after the morning and afternoon passed, with no sign whatsoever of any returning partygoers, people began to worry. When it became evident that not a single person that had been to that party had returned home, a group of the older and more responsible menfolk walked all the way over to Flaherty Farm to see what the crack was. Apparently, they knew something was wrong from how quiet the place was as they approached. But it was only once they were there that they realized